were just suddenly like prompted to just sit with the words for a minute, you know. It was almost like he intervened and stopped your internet right right when it needed to be cut. But yeah, you know, when I was listening to the words that I'm sorry, Cornelia, did I get it right that you're Sam's mom?
I am.
Okay, so first of all, this is dope that you're like on a podcast with my mom's 93. She just turned 93.
Oh, lucky woman.
And yeah, and it kind of makes me feel like I should be doing podcasts with her. So I appreciate the inspiration. But when I was listening to Cornelia Reed, you know, the word love, like his use of the word love, always sort of jumps out at me, because I feel like, particularly with young people in schools, that words like love, like family, like community, get you know, bantered around a lot, and because they sound good and they feel good, but particularly for the most vulnerable and wounded children, schools are the antithesis of those things. They're places that undermine love, and then undermine family, and then undermine community. And sometimes that undermining is done, maybe even oftentimes it's done by people who don't have the intention to be doing harm at all. You know, that's not why they're there. It's not what the work they signed up to do. And I'm certainly, you know, count myself among those who has participated in doing those things sometimes, in my efforts to be an educator in my community. And so I think that, you know, what I really appreciate about his words are his calling us to attention, that love demands of us awareness. And it's both an awareness of ourselves, and an awareness of those that we are loving and attempting to create loving spaces for. And I think the way in which we've designed schools, the way in which we've designed the life of teachers, the way in which we've designed the life of school leaders, the way in which we've designed the life of children and family in those schools, is directly, and I argue and have argued for some time now, intentionally interruptive of creating spaces that are committed to truth telling. And I think that it's really hard to create spaces of awareness if you're not willing to tell the truth. And I think that he's really lifting that up, that like in order for us to really be aware about what the most vulnerable and most wounded children need, we have to be willing, both as individuals and as a nation, to tell the truth about what has created those conditions. You know, there's a great film series put out by PBS a few years ago called Unnatural Causes. And it's the largest research study ever conducted in the world on the impact of inequality. And it's really a beautiful work in a lot of ways. It's very cross-disciplinary. So there's, you know, so many voices are included in the discussion. And the conclusion after this massive study is that the biggest threat to health and wellness on the planet is inequality. And and the United States is the most radically unequal of any of the industrialized nations ever, right? Like we're the global champs at structuring inequality in our society. And you don't need to look very much further than the way in which we've designed schools to see the commitment to maintaining that lack of wellness, right? That radicalized inequality in our society. And so I really feel like what he's calling me to as an educator is an awareness both about the need for action on my part and awareness about what is this institution that I'm walking into, right? And I think that a lot of the conversations I hear going on in schools about quote unquote school improvement, right? Whatever the language is of the day, begins with the premise that schools are broken, right? And that they're not working. And so then that leads one to then like start tinkering, right? As David Tayek said, right? Start tinkering towards utopia. And I don't think schools are broken, because I think schools are doing exactly what they're designed to do. And that's sort of the definition of like a functioning system, right? And if we look at it that way, if we look at schools not as broken and not needing fix, but actually needing a fundamental rethink, then I think we start ourselves down a very different path. And so a lot of the work that that myself and colleagues around the country that I really connect with and respect have been doing is to call for repurpose and to go back to the basic foundational fundamental question of for what? Like, why do we take children by law from their families for 8 hours a day for 13 consecutive years? Why are we doing it? And I think that part of the problem is that we act as though schools are a presumed public good. And I'd like to engage in a conversation that suggests that they're not. That and to really ask ourselves, why are we doing this? Like, what is the purpose of public schools in a society that is actually committed, not rhetorically, but really committed to building a pluralistic multiracial democracy? Why do we have a public school system in that with those commitments? And it is my sense and sensibility that the answer is singular. The reason that we have public schools, the reason I send my children to school is so that they can be more well. Punto. That's it. And the expectation that I have, and I think the expectation of a lot of the families that I've served over my 30 years in East Oakland have, is singular. And the expectation is, when I bring my child to you, institution, school, teacher, and I hand them off to you, and I turn my back and walk away, which, by the way, I was a high school teacher for a long time. And you don't really see that in high school, because like 15-year-olds are really not trying to have their parents walk them up hand in hand to the door of the school building. Although, I'll probably insist that my sons allow me to do that, but
and just as readily insist that you not.
Yes, right. And that's okay. Like, I don't mind embarrassing my sons with kisses and hugs. But it really hit me when our community opened a school called the Rose and Concrete Community School about 8 years ago. And the first day of that school was probably one of the most transformative moments of my life. Like, not just my teaching life or my research life, like of my life. Because I was standing out on the steps of the school, and I watched all these parents, some of whom were literally my former students who were bringing me their children, right? Some of whom were people that I had literally never met. And they bring these precious babies to us, 6, 7, 8 years old, so vulnerable, right? And they give them over to us, and then they pivot and walk away. And I was like, wow, that is so deep. And Roses in Concrete was the first school I'd ever been to that actually honored that moment. Every single day, right? Every single day, we staffed the steps to look parents in the eye and say, thank you, right? For trusting us with your baby, right? And what I realized in that moment is that what I think the purpose of public schools is and should be is a singular promise to every parent that our promise to you is that when you pick your child up at 2:45 or 3 or whenever, right, pickup happens, your child will be more well than when you left them with us. That's it. That's my only promise to you. And I know, as someone that's been teaching for 30 years, that that's impossible to do with every single child. I can't even do that with my own children in my own house every single day, right? So I understand that it's an impossible promise, but it's a promise that must be made anyway. And that what comes behind it, with that knowing, with that truth telling, with that honesty, that we won't deliver on the promise. We're going to miss the mark sometimes. And we're going to, and when we do, we're going to atone. And I think atonement is not taught in schools. Apology is taught in schools. And apology and atonement are very different things, right? So what we norm in school, what we teach in school, is that if you hurt somebody on the playground, you have to say sorry. But you don't actually have to mean it. And the person that got harmed is supposed to accept it, even if they know you don't mean it, or even if they don't feel like accepting it, right? And then that's it, right? And so now we see that over and over and over in leadership, right? But, and I don't mean leadership in schools. I mean, quote unquote, leadership in the broader society. And it's not that there's an expectation that you won't screw up or you won't do harm sometimes, because you're a human being. So of course you will, right? But atonement does require apology. And I think apology is important, like acknowledging, right, that you have caused harm in some way. But atonement then pursues or attempts to create the conditions for making right the harm that was done. And sometimes you can't, right? But it's the commitment, right, to saying that you acknowledge you're wrong, you apologize for it, and then you're going to do the best that you can to make it right again, right? And of course, this nation is the only industrialized nation in the history of the world to have committed 2 genocides and never owned either one of them, right? So it's not shocking to me at all that we've created a school system that teaches apology instead of atonement. But if we make that commitment, okay, to say your child will leave at the end of the day more well, and we miss the mark, then for me, atonement is that we acknowledge it, right, to the child, to the family, and the next day when that child shows up, there's a scorecard in our head, and that there's a debt due to that child. And so more medicine is poured in, right? More resources are poured in. And we do the exact opposite. Those who have the most get the most in schools, and those who have the least get the least. And so the kids that are the most likely to be harmed are the kids with the least resources to actually make meaning and heal from that. They're the most vulnerable and the most wounded ones. And then when we harm them in schools, and they come back, and we use words like love and community and family, right? That just magnifies the harm. So I want to have a conversation because I feel like if we do that with one generation of children, what that would mean for individual communities and for this nation would be massive, right? Because their whole sense of an awareness about what is owed to them, right, as sacred beings would change. Because for 8 hours a day for 13 consecutive years, right, that would be their experience, right? So when I think about what Thich Nhat Hanh said, or at least that particular piece, right, that's what comes up for me, is that how are we going to create the conditions where we norm that kind of awareness and commitment to love in our society, if we don't norm that kind of awareness and commitment to love with our children in our schools?
And so I have a question that's related to that and to your conversation of atonement. And I guess what it relates to, and actually before I say this, I just want to also remind everybody that the questions that you have, please place them in the chat, and we will, as soon as the rest of you are ready, expand this conversation beyond the two of us. But so my question is, and it's a question for everybody, how do we orient ourselves to the scope of the challenge? And in particular, what I'm thinking about is, you know, in the idea of creating loving spaces of awareness and truth telling, I mean, it seems pretty irrefutable to say that one of the fundamental poisons of our culture is the incompatibility of democracy and capitalism, and our ability to try to honor both, when in fact we only honor one. That, you know, democracy, a pluralistic multiracial democracy, owes its primary allegiance to the cultivation of conscience, right? To that spirit of atonement. And obviously everybody knows that's not what capitalism is about. It's about consumption, not conscience. So what I'm wondering is how you orient yourself to the scope of that challenge in your work. I mean, obviously one answer is you create a remarkable place like Roses in Concrete. Another, of course, is you try to spread the awareness of our need to create conditions for norming love in our society through your faculty. But you're also just a human being who occasionally has to get overwhelmed by, you know, the way James Baldwin said, right? Like, trouble is out there, hungry as a tiger, and trouble looms longer than the sky. So how do you reconcile the urgency of the work with the inevitable occasional feelings of hopelessness when you look around and see the world as it is today?
Well, so those are two very different questions. I'm not sure how to reconcile the challenge of squaring a circle that is attempting to hold capitalism and democracy simultaneously. I think it is a profoundly important question, and I'm not entirely sure, like, if, you know, to me, it's like, I think capitalism also is a pretty easy mark, because it's, one of my favorite Cornel West quotes that I often use is he once said that there is no affirmation through negation. And so, I think that that I certainly have plenty of critiques of capitalism and the way it's unfolded in this nation and in other spaces, and its relationship to colonialism and conquest and white supremacy and et cetera, et cetera. I am not entirely sure, coming out of my critique, what I would offer in its stead. Because when I look at the other offerings, they're also pretty dim and scary, right? The way in which they actually rolled out, right, in people's lives. So I think it's a really important question, right, and one that I'm always interested in having some conversation around. But I think with respect to your second question and schools in particular, I feel much more clear-headed about my critique and my alternative, right? That I feel like with respect to children and schools, that I can say with a fairly high level of clarity and lucidity that it doesn't have to be this way because it can be this way, right? And I think that that's really important, right? That this society, and part of what capitalism, right, engenders, and particularly the academy and the use of the university system, and right, to validate its own like wickedness in a lot of ways. That part of what happens in our university training is that we get rewarded for being really good at critique and tearing down. Right. And there's no real expectation that you build anything. Right. In fact, you often get critiqued for building. Right. And so I think that that's a really important, but then that goes back to what we do in schools. Right. And how we treat what it means to be educated. And one of the distinctions that I draw out is one that I don't know if any of you are familiar with the work of Angela Valenzuela, but she wrote a book. She's at UT Austin, and she wrote a book called Subtractive Schooling. And in there, she crafts this really powerful binary, really through the voices of children, where they would draw out these distinctions in their interactions with adults, between the adults that wanted to school them and adults that wanted to educate them, right? And so my interpretation of that work is that schooling and education are not the same thing, right? Schooling is the process by which you institutionalize people to accept their position in life. And that position is then validated through critiquing everything, right? And building nothing. Whereas education is the process by which you work in collaboration with people to help them understand that they can transform the conditions of their life. And that part of that transformation is a responsibility, back to Thich Nhat Hanh's point, of a commitment to love and community, that you can't, it's all of us or none of us, right? So, and some of probably the best work I've seen that really addresses that in a profound way is the book by Heather McGhee that just came out, called The Sum of Us. Is that, let me make sure I got that right. I feel like I'm confusing authors from.
No, you got it. That's right.
Okay. All right. So, and the point that she makes is that what this mashup of the rhetoric of democracy and the reality of capitalism, right, have created for us is this zero-sum game story, where if we actually address the genocide against indigenous people and the genocide against African people and the radicalized inequality that we built in this society, then if we actually do that, right, then we'll all be more well. But the general sensibility which gets coded in through school is that if we atone, if we make right for African people, the ways in which this society has done so much harm to them and continues to do harm to their community, then other communities will lose out, right? They'll have to lose something in order for African people, right, to gain. So it's this zero-sum game, right, that then is totally normed in schools, right? The way in which we assess children, the way in which we code progress based on some concept of age development, which all of the neuroscience and psychologies and child development experts say like is absurd. Like everybody knows that development is jagged, right? Everybody knows that every 8-year-old is not going to be at the same place at the same time, right? But we continue to code that into schools, right, to create this really powerful sorting mechanism that serves the broader project. So I think that except, right, except I see that all the time, except when I'm around children. So your second question is, in those moments, like what is it that really creates hope for me in moments where I'm feeling hopeless? And the honest answer to that is I stay around young people. Like it is a regular practice for me to be around, and I don't just mean my sons, right? Like I mean young people in my community. And for that reason, I am an eminently hopeful dude. And to, I'll draw Cornel West in again here because he makes this really important distinction between hope and optimism, right? I'm not optimistic, right? This interview I heard him do once, he said that, like, he said, as a Black man in America, I have not had an optimistic day in my life. Because optimism is predicated on an evaluation of the existing circumstances and a belief based on that evaluation that things will get better. And he said, I am not optimistic at all, but I am hopeful, because hope is when emerges from a space in your spirit and in the teachings of your ancestors and your elders and your community, right? That has you look at the evaluation of the existing conditions and believe that things will get better anyway. And there's no group that makes me feel more like that than young people, because despite all of the shit that we throw at them, all the shit that we put them through, they still show up every day. They still wake up every day with this energy that I swear I can't wrap my head around it. Why? As a nation, we are so committed to crushing the joy and the wondering out of our children. And so when I am in those moments of despair, where I really feel like my hopefulness is under attack, I am very intentional about going and getting time with children and playing with them. Like, not like being the adult, right? But returning to that sense of joy and wondering and wonderment and genuine curiosity and love and hope. And there's, different strokes for different folks, but I'll tell you, like, one of the purest places to go for that is kindergarten. You know what I'm saying? Like, just go to kindergarten and you can't help but crack up, because them kids are doing stuff that's just like, it is so far afield from what it is that school is asking them to do, right? And you can't contain that box. It will not be contained. And it's the greatest lesson that I feel like children have ever taught me, right? Is that that you've got to have that reserve fuel tank that you can tap into. Because when you're doing this work, and you're so embedded in so many, institutional practices and kind of daily norms that you experience as an adult, that if you don't have that place you go to remind yourself about that it's going to be all right. It's going to be all right because 5 and 6 year olds are still going to find a way to play, no matter how freaking hard we try to knock that out of them. And that's how in my worst moments, right, I try to not take myself too seriously, right? Not take all the things that are rattling around my head too seriously, and just put it down for a little bit and remind myself about that there's a lot for us to learn from our children. As much as we're trying to teach them, there's a lot that they really can and should be teaching us.
I have, that's beautiful. I have a question to ask related to it, but I also want to pause because I know that on this call, we have a lot of other educators and school founders and a lot of wisdom. And I'm wondering if there is a specific question that somebody else would like to ask next. And then obviously to just confirm that if you do, make sure that you take yourself off mute, and I'll just give it a beat.
I see Vicky's hand.
Vicky, break it down for us.
What? Write it down?
No, yeah, sorry. Go ahead. What's your question?
Oh, good, because I can't write it. I'm just so excited. So Sam, I want to thank you for including that link to his talk on your announcement, because I just finished watching that before I came on. And I think I told you, Sam, I just got elected to school committee, and tonight is my second meeting. And I was so excited, Jeff, about what you presented today. And the question at the end of your presentation, or toward the end, was something that's so classic for educators these days. Well, where do I start? Tell me what to do. Where's the scripted curriculum we are all used to using? How can I do this on my own? So I just have this whole page scribbled of ideas from your presentation, Jeff. And at the core, I circled it in pink, and it said, create conditions of wellness. And I thought, okay, be a Thich Nhat Hanh, channel him and say, okay, show me where to go from here. So I think that's the biggest obstacle that I have right now in the district that I'm in, because I substitute taught for 3 years before I decided to run. And I used to teach all levels, even college. So I love what you said about staying with kids. But I know that whatever direction I go, if I can just be still instead of all hyper like I usually am and trying to force things down people's throat, I can breathe into it and move into it. So more than a question is more that a statement of gratitude, and know that, Thich Nhat Hanh tells everybody that even though his body is not here, we'll be channeling him every time we breathe. Jeff, I'm going to be channeling you every time I'm at a school committee meeting, but I'm definitely going to go and do more ethnographic work with parents and students after your talk. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. Just out of curiosity, which talk did you get access to?
It was your Google one.
Equality
Yeah.
versus or equity.
Okay, cool. Yeah. I think that I saw a comment earlier from somebody that was, referencing the fact that a lot of teachers are wounded. And so, there's the saying that hurt people hurt people. And I think that saying is it's a saying for a reason, right? Like it's accurate, it's true. But there's a second part to that I think we don't talk about or acknowledge. So hurt people, and healed people heal people. And so if we want to create the conditions of wellness in schools, we have to be aware that that there's a debt due to teachers, right? And this is a slippery slope for me, because I've watched where that then creates a very adult-centric culture that that isn't necessarily bad, but that I think then finds itself at odds with creating youth wellness. And I've never figured out as a school leader how to strike that sweet balance, right, between really supporting teachers and creating the conditions where that support doesn't become an excuse for some of our colleagues to not invest in the way in which they need to really support, right, children. But I think that the absence of any serious conversation about what teacher wellness needs to look like, it virtually guarantees that you're not going to have institution-wide youth wellness, right? So we have to understand that schools are a micro ecosystem. And so if anybody in a micro ecosystem is not well, right, that ripples throughout the micro ecosystem. And so, you know, like if children and or adults are showing up wounded, then that trauma is going to be shared across spaces, right? And I think that to answer your question about like where do we start, you know, the place I start with teachers is to try to create the conditions for them to dream again. I feel like one of the first things that is taken from teachers is the right to dream. And I promise you this, that if you are not a dreamer, there is no way in hell you're cultivating the conditions for the children that you serve to be a dreamer. So one of the like starting workshops that I always do when I'm going into schools and working with teachers is to create the conditions for them to dream again. And I ask them one question, and this is a whole, you know, series of workshops that myself and a group of my colleagues developed over years and years and years of working with teachers, and finding that yeah, like they often, like they're so undermined, right, and beaten down that they really are saying like, just show me how to do it, right? Just give me the playbook. And I think we have to disabuse teachers of that idea that there is a playbook, because there isn't one, right? But then to say that they already have the playbook. And and the way that we do that is to ask them first, who have you always wanted to be as a teacher? Like, just dream again. You can be any teacher you want, right? And we take them through this whole workshop where they write their own philosophy of being a teacher that is a reflection of their absolute best self. The teacher, when they first started out in the gig, that they right, like what happens to teachers, right, who 22, 23 years old, and they are just on fire, right? And then it's just ripped out of them over and over and over and over and over again. So we try to take everybody back to that, right? And to have them write it down, like, who are you as your best self? And you know what's a trip about what they write? It is the bar that they set for themselves is crazy high. It is so much higher than anything in their contract, right? And administrators are pulling their hair out to try and get teachers to just keep their contract, right? And it's because you've taken away, like, the contract is a joke. Like, that's not actually why we're there, but we have to have this to protect ourselves because you're fucking us up, right? So we create these incredible, right, visions that are coming not from me, or the admin or central office or the feds, right? But from the teachers themselves. And I guarantee you, if we had the teachers that our teachers say they want to be, so much of the stuff we're talking about here today would be unnecessary, right? Which for me, as a teacher of teachers, but also a teacher of children, right? I feel the same way about children. Like if you let children describe the kind of student they really want to be, they're the apple of our eyes, right? So when they're not showing up in that way, as a teacher, I have two choices, right? I can look at them and say that they need to change, the people with the least amount of power. Or I can look at myself and say, I need to change the conditions for this child to really be who they already are. And I think we have to do the same thing with teachers, right? If you ask teachers who they want to be, and they tell you what they're going to tell you, which is like incredibly engaging, great relationships with students, great relationships with families, very collaborative, right? All the things we say we want, right, is who they really want to be. And they're not being that, then the question has to be, why not? Right? What is wrong with the structures that we've put together where teachers are not being who they really want to be? And so the second thing we do in that workshop is to ask them, what do you need from us to be the teacher you always wanted to be? What's the PD you need? What's the schedule you need? What's the resources you need? What's the time you need? And then that's the marching orders. That's the mandate for the administration, right? Is to go get these teachers what they need to really show up in the way in which they want to show up, right? And a lot of administrators are like, damn, like I never even thought of that. You know what I mean? Like I never even thought that I need to differentiate support for my teachers. Differentiated instruction is the gold standard when we engage in a practice of teaching young people.
It's funny that you say that because I'm in Chicago because we're working with a school here, and we were with the entire faculty yesterday, 60 adults sitting in a circle in a poorly heated, traditional cafeteria. And they're about to shift to a new campus with a very different model, beautiful model, but one that nonetheless is going to require everybody to show up a little bit differently. I have a question related to that for you in a moment. But the first thing we did was we just asked them, what do you need in order to be successful? And that's what's going to shape the work. Related to that, I want to ask you a question. I also want to acknowledge we're at the top of the hour. Maybe I can ask you a question. We'll see if there's one more and then we'll wrap. So in about 15 minutes. Is that
okay? Yeah.
Good. The question is, and first, by way of context, like we've been doing this for a year now, every week. And I think the second guest we had was Liz Lerman. I don't know if you know her work. She's a choreographer. She's won a MacArthur grant, and she does really interesting stuff in general, but particularly blending art and science. So she did this whole thing where she was fascinated by, DNA and the double helix. And she does a lot of multimedia stuff. And so the first part is she and some other people were in the offices of these scientists, right? Like in their comfort zone, like behind their desk doing their thing. And she was saying, well, if the double helix was a dance, what would it do? And because they were safe and they didn't have to actually do it, they described it. And then if you're at the performance, you're watching this, and then you see the actual dancers acting out what the scientists say the dance double helix should be. So cool, right? So I want to do a variation of that with you, because last week our guest was Roseanne Bosch, who is a Dutch designer. She's originally an artist. She's not even trained as an architect, but now she's like one of the finest architects in the world, learning spaces. And obviously, you're a different kind of designer, but you're not an architect. But there's a fair number of architects on this call, and there's a lot of good people on this call who spend a lot of time thinking like, well, what should the space be? And so the question is, as a non-designer in that way, but as somebody that pays deep attention to the needs of people and the ways in which environments can feed them. If we think about truly designing a loving space of awareness and creating the conditions for norming love and orienting ourselves primarily through the extent to which we are able to engender wellness. And let's imagine that you were a designer and you were given an actual opportunity to craft a physical environment that could help give birth to the kind of intangible connections and support and love that you're talking about. Where does your mind immediately go? What would that place look like and not look like?
Well, I think that one of the mistakes that we make in education is that we try to answer questions like that in a way that we can McDonaldize it, right? Like we can scale it, right? And then, oh, this would be like a school-wide practice that is in every school in our district. And I think that, you know, how's that going for us, right? So I think the first answer that I would have is not unlike one of the things that Vicky brought up, which is that I think to answer that question, that I would really have to spend time with the community where we're trying to construct that, right? And I certainly have my own ideas, you know, about what I would like to see, but those ideas are almost always morphed and shaped and reshaped by the space and the place. And, you know, I think that we also have this strong desire in education to sanitize the work. And, you know, I've often said that I actually wanted my students to show up fully human. And that means you can't sanitize, right, the woundedness. That I've always felt as an educator that the meaning is in the mess. And if you don't create the conditions where you can sit in the mess and make meaning together, then your option, the alternative, is to sanitize them. And that means to get rid of the truth telling, to get, you know, my Theo and one of my best maestros is a brother named Jerry Teo. And he's one of the founders of the National Compadres Network. He'd be a great person for you to have on this podcast. Anyway, he says that the wounded ones speak the most truth.
Yes.
And we resent them for it. Because the truth speaking that comes from the wounded one is unvarnished. They're done, right? They're not trying to code it anymore. And when they come with all that mess, and it's not their mess, it's the mess that we've put them in, then the one thing that almost every school is really good at is getting rid of that kid. Because we want to sanitize this project. And so I think to create a space that is generative of the kinds of interactions and relationships that Thich Nhat Hanh talked about in that piece, that there has to be a commitment to sitting in the mess and knowing that, you know, like as an educator, you know, you come with a plan, right? You come with a, you know, this is what we're going to do today. And, you know, I've been banging on this craft for 30 years. And I can tell you right now that I have never developed a plan that went to plan. Because the plan then like is brought to like a human interaction with 25 other souls or 35 other souls, depending on where you teach, right? And then that's when you find out if you can teach, right? Is can you read and react, right, to what it is that the wounded ones are telling you actually needs to happen in that moment? And can you believe profoundly enough in their truth telling that if you read and react, that actually that's the lesson, that's the rigor, right? And you can teach every single subject, content, standard through that lens, through the lens of wellness. I can teach reading, I can teach writing, I can teach math, I can teach science, I can teach art. Everything that we say we want to teach in schools, you can do it, right? As long as you understand that the foundation, the return point, the pinpoint, the thing that stops everything is the well-being of the most vulnerable and most wounded ones. Always keeping the focus there. Everything can stop for the wounded child, right? And the instructiveness of that for the child who has stability at home, right? That's how you build healthy, loving communities, is that you keep the focus on those that have the least, that need the most, right? And then you build out from there, knowing that when you heal the wounded one, they become healers, right? There's less and less hurt when you're attentive to the hurt. And what that needs to look like structurally, right, spatially, I think needs to reflect the community that you're in. So the way in which I think this happens is the way in which I like to talk about it is an approach that I borrow from Brian Stevenson. I don't know how many of you are familiar with Brian Stevenson. He'd be another great person to have on here, but you know, arguably the most successful death row lawyer in the United States. And I was in a talk with him once, and one of the things that he said to me that has just stuck with me forever, he said, you know, the challenge of this, right, what you're putting out there right now, Sam, the challenge of creating justice and equity and freedom and love inside of this society is unmet, not because we don't have a whole bunch of really smart, really committed people that are working on that, because we do. He says the problem is that so many of us that are working on that are working on that from our own worldview. And so we see the suffering and we're like, damn, like I've got to do something about that. And so we concoct this intervention, right? This school, this syllabus, this lesson, this, you know, community project, whatever it is, right? We concoct this intervention. And all of the details of that, right, are emergent from our own positionality. And what Brian Stevenson says is effectively what we end up with is aspirin. We start handing out aspirin. And aspirin does temporarily relieve the symptoms of a headache, but it does not stop you from getting headaches, because aspirin doesn't deal with the root cause. And he says what we need to really push this forward is we need a commitment to getting proximate to the pain. So for me, my answer to that question is that one of the first things I would do is get proximity to the pain I was trying to resolve, right? Not create like a loving space at 30,000 feet where it's all like beautiful, because everything works on the whiteboard. But on the ground, it's messy, right? So you got to get into the mess, and you got to get proximity to the pain, and then you got to humble up, and you got to hush up, and you got to really listen. And you meaning me, right? That we have to really listen, and we have to understand that the wounded ones know what they need. They know how to heal the pain, but nobody's listening. That's why they light off dynamite, because they're communicating to us in every way, shape, and fashion. Can you not fucking see me? Can you not see what's happening to me? I know you see it. I know you see it. And I keep hearing you say every day that you care and you love me, but you don't fucking see it. So I'm going to make you see it. I'm going to light off a stick of dynamite. I'm going to throw a desk, right? I'm going to punch another human being. I'm going to tag on your walls. I'm going to rip out the seat in the bathroom. You're going to see me. And instead of finally saying, oh shit, I have not been seeing you, and then getting curious and wondering, like, what's going on? Because I know that's not who you want to be. And this is sure as shit not the relationship I want with you. So what's going on? What happened? And what do you need? And then I'm just a glorified gopher. Then my job as somebody who really cares about somebody that is wounded is to go try and find what it is that they've said they need. And when we come in that way, we can start to construct spaces that are what the term that we've been using is community responsive, right? So I think it really is about saying that get proximity to the pain and make an authentic commitment to being an ethnographer of the community that you serve, so that you can create spaces that are truly responsive to the material conditions and the historical realities of the community where you're doing the work. My last caveat around this, the asterisk on it is know that it's going to change, because every community changes. And so I think we also, even when we do that, we get locked into, oh, well, that worked yesterday, so that must be the solution. And then when it doesn't work the next day, we blame the people with the least amount of resources, because in our heads, we figured it out, right? So continuing to pulse check, continuing, right, to stay inside of the messiness is essential, not to the initial creation of the space, but to sustaining that space, right? And I think that that is a part of the work that isn't attended to enough. It's a part of Thich Nhat Hanh's work that I don't think people pay attention. How did he do that for so long, right? And because I think everybody's trying to get there as if it's a destination. And I really want to understand, what does it mean not to be well, but to be on a life committed journey of wellness, knowing that it's not an endpoint, right? And I think those are the kind of spaces that I've been chasing after my whole life. And, you know,
Yeah, well,
I'll probably go to the grave still trying to do it.
we're chasing them with you. And I know I speak on behalf of everybody by saying thank you, Jeff, for coming here today, sharing your thoughts and your passion and your wisdom. And I would like to suggest, in the spirit of what you've been talking about, that the best way we can end, by way of a gift back to you and to one another, is with maybe 5 minutes, no more. Everybody take yourselves off mute. And I'm curious, what's one little shard that you're taking with you? Maybe it was something Jeff said. Maybe it's a question that remains unresolved in mind. Maybe it's an epiphany that you've had. But let's end with everybody's voices and getting a sense of what each carrying away with them today.
Creating spaces for wellness.
Spend time with children.
Get close to the pain, lock into the pain, stay with it.
Do
Keep the
something,
dreams.
build something.
What do you need to be successful? What do
The
you need?
meaning is in the mess.
Every situation is different.
embrace our mutual vulnerability.
We actually have what we need. We just need to trust the children and ourselves.
Know yourself, know the child.
Your attachment.
Humble up and hush up.
The wounded know what they need. Are we listening?
Spaces of awareness.
Who do you want to be?
There's a kind way to be honest.
Healed people heal people. So Jeff, thank you. And everybody, thank you. Thank you for coming here. Thank you for making the time to be here for one another. Just a reminder, every Friday at noon Eastern, the Seed and Spark has its community council meeting. There's information about that on the network. Could somebody else, because I'm suddenly now on my phone, maybe drop in the link to the virtual network in the chat before we all scatter? That's where you'll find a full list of our events and information about that. And then next Wednesday, the first Wednesday of February, which means it's going to be our Kairos meeting, which is primarily a chance to hear the stories of one another. I would be remiss, however, if before I go, I didn't also just give a plug so that you can read it in time, that February 19th, Rebecca Giggs is coming all the way from Perth, Australia, to talk about her book, Fathoms, The World in the Whale. And if you have not yet read Fathoms, The World in the Whale, find it. The question that Rebecca has asked to entice us all to that meeting is, what can animals teach us about the future of the world? So look forward to seeing you down the road. But again, Jeff, thank you for coming.
Thank you, everybody. Please be well. Take good care of yourselves.